Welcome to another episode of Thoughts in Bolts. I'm your host, Pedro Oliveria, and tonight I want to talk a little bit about Die Glocke. Um, I think anybody who really studies the UFO phenomenon seriously will come to the conclusion that there are two kinds of UFOs, right? The kind humans make and the kind non-humans make. Um, I think everyone agrees with the first half of that statement, right? That there are UFOs that are made by human beings. But for the second half of that statement, that there are UFOs made by non-humans, all one has to do is to study the UFO phenomenon as it existed before World War II, into the Middle Ages, and into antiquity, and you just that's the only conclusion that one can rationally come to is that there are unidentified objects in the skies that we don't make. And there are also UFOs that we do make. So, with regards to the ones we do make, um, the question of the Glocke, whether or not this machine ever existed, actually makes man-made UFOs, the really anomalous ones, more plausible. So if you're a super skeptic about UFOs, pay attention to this, because this would actually kind of bolster your case with regards to some UFOs being made by human beings. Again, why am I interested in this? I'm just kind of reviewing Tom DeLonge's historical fiction Chasing Shadows. This episode kind of dovetails with my last episode, Ancient Aryans. So if you haven't watched it, please do. Um, but Tom DeLonge spends quite a bit of time in his book with Die Glocke, right? Um, Now, Die Glocke and Hans Kammler. Okay, so who was Hans Kammler? Hans Kammler was a very high-ranking official in the SS. Um, some would say the SS was the Third Reich within the Third Reich. It was the government within the government. Um, it was analogous to what we would call, the intelligence community slash military industrial complex all rolled into one. And, it was run by Heinrich Himmler, but Hans Kammler was right up there with him. And even toward the end of the war, he would disobey Himmler's orders and do what he wanted anyway. Hans Kammler was not a scientist, but he was a very effective organizer. So much so that he is credited uh, ignobly with the efficiency of the concentration camps. Hans Kammler was not a good man in a bad situation. He was a very bad man in a bad situation. He was a monster, essentially. And, making concentration camps more efficient is all you need to do to earn that title. Uh, I, anyways, the thing about Hans Kammler is that he was in charge of the Wunderwaffe, these top secret German military projects. And he was the manager of the scientists who were working on those projects. And there was always a question about what happened to him after World War II because nobody ever found his body. His chauffeur testified that he had killed himself, and so everyone just said, okay, well, that settles that he killed himself. But there was never any real proof of that. And so, various people have speculated that he may have survived World War II. That is what the Secret Machines books say. I'm not going to spoil it for you, but in the Secret Machines books, he does die, but he does not die in Europe, and he dies after World War II. Actually, he dies very far in a location very far from Europe, very far down south. And he dies, but it's long after World War II is over. And what I find interesting about that is that, the Secret Machines books were published in 2016. Again, Tom DeLonge was not the first person to make this claim, but In 2019, this very intelligent gentleman wrote this book called The Hidden Nazi, in which he persuasively argues that yes, Hans Kammler did survive World War II and that he was captured by the Allies, and that, he spilled his guts with regards to top secret German weapons in exchange for his life. This is evidence, some of the evidence used to substantiate that claim. Another paper was written the same year that you can find on the Wilson Center website, arguing the same thing through similar lines of evidence and argumentation that yes, indeed, Hans Kammler did survive World War II. He was captured by the Allies, and he did spill his guts with regards to secret Nazi tech in exchange for his life. Um, and Kammler has always been connected with Die Glocke. So, what is Die Glocke? Um, you can read about it in The Hunt for Zero Point. I'm not going to read this. I'm just going to leave it there. You can pause, read it for yourself. Same thing with this passage or collection of passages from the book. But essentially, the Glocke was this machine that used this kind of counter-rotating uh, process, of these electrically charged, machines, this counter-rotating process, um, in order to create some kind of distortion in gravity. Uh, and when it was turned on, it would glow with this soft blue light, and they put plants around it and little animals in cages to see what would happen. And as the story goes, um, these animals and these plants would prematurely age and die. People who were working on and around the Glocke, even with protective clothing, would get sick and have serious health consequences. This whole story was unearthed by a Polish um, journalist who, on the other side of the Iron Curtain, was able to locate some documents supposedly that showed one of Kammler's associates, General Sporenberg, um, when he got captured by the Allies, supposedly he spilled his guts, and one of the things he talked about was Ibaka, and this is where all that information supposedly comes from. Sub Project Kronos, which again is the Titan of time in Greek mythology. Um, but that's the Glock in essence. It was uh, purported to be the German first step in cracking gravity. It was nascent anti-gravity technology. Okay, that's what the story says, right? Um, Now, what I find interesting about this is that Tom DeLonge uh, connects not just Hans Stammler to the Glocke, which is expected, but he also connects the Glocke and Kammler to the UFO phenomenon. He wasn't the first one to do this. Joseph Farrell wrote a series of books on the Nazi connection to the UFO phenomenon. Um, but what I find interesting is some of the evidence that can be used to make an abductive argument that it's possible the Glocke was real. I don't think you can prove it was real, but you can prove that it's possible that it might be real. Because if the Glocke is connected somehow with the UFO phenomenon, then you would find connections between the Glocke and the UFO phenomenon, right? You would find similarities, and that's exactly what you have. If you go back to the 1950s contactees like George Adamski, Giorgiani has pointed this out in his book. Joseph Farrell has too. Um, in their interactions with the Nords, again, how do these flying saucers supposedly fly? Again, they fly using a similar counter rotation principle in their engineering, right? They fly using electrogravitics, and somehow that involves, again, some counter rotation mechanism, with one ring going one way and another ring going the other way, just like the Glocke. Um, what's interesting is in the Alien Files by Warren P. Aston, who's a UFO researcher from Australia, he uncovered this close encounter narrative from an experiencer named Udo Vartena or Udo Vartena. He was Dutchman, not Hispanic. He was a Dutchman in the United States, Dutch immigrant apparently, and he encountered a flying saucer with again these white people with white hair, and he goes inside, and again, how does their flying saucer fly? Again, supposedly, again with this counter rotating mechanism, right? This principle of counter rotation in their craft that somehow creates some distortion in gravity, which allows the craft to fly. Okay, so that's another connection with the Glocke, right? You have at least two different accounts of visits by the Nordics that involve this counter rotation principle in their engineering, and that's what you find in the Glocke. And of course, the Nazis were obsessed with Nordics, with the Nordic phenotype. Um, Salvador Pais wrote a paper on high frequency gravitational waves and their possible use for propulsion. And I think it's interesting that he mentions the possibility that high frequency accelerated axial rotation, which means spin, and or accelerated high frequency vibration of an electrically charged structure could probably cause uh, these high frequency gravitational waves. So to understand what a gravitational wave is, imagine space-time like a sheet of paper, and these waves would just like be ripples in that sheet of paper, or imagine it like a big blanket, right? Imagine space-time like a blanket, and imagine yourself shaking the blanket, and that would approximate these gravitational waves, right? According to general relativity. And even though Pais doesn't mention counter rotation, I think it's interesting that he talks about rotation with regards to some electrically charged structure. And what could you do with these gravitational waves? Well, again, you could create a craft that has all the features of a UFO, right? It would be transmedium. It could fly in space, in the air, and underwater. Okay. So again, I think that's get some credit. We should give some credit there with as a somewhat of a convergence with what we see in the whole Die Glocke and the 1950s and 40s contactee narratives. Again, another part of the Glocke that I find interesting is this this account of how being in proximity to the Glocke when it was turned on had a deleterious effect on living organisms. Okay, so plants would prematurely age and lose their chlorophyll. If you go and again read up on Gippon's work, so Gippon is the office within the French Space Agency, okay, the CNES, France's version of NASA, okay. If they have a UFO office that works on civilian cases and they publish their reports. They do good science. And if you look at the Trans in Provence case from 1983, where again this object that looked like kind of like two dishes, put on top of each other at the lips, um, landed in somebody's backyard and left this kind of like a ring of burnt space area right on the grass. And the scientists at Gipon took samples of the grass right from the center of the alleged landing spot out from that center, outwards for several feet. And guess what? The plants in that area lost much of their chlorophyll. They prematurely aged. And this effect was most pronounced the closer one got to the center, right? So again, this is a similar effect as described in the stories about the Glocke. And this is a very easy document to find online. Find it, you know, put it in, you know, Chat GPT if you can't speak French, and read it for yourself. Um, Again, Hal Puthoff's paper on space-time metric engineering, right? Vacuum engineering. Again, if some kind of craft were to fly by engineering the space-time metric, um, one of the effects that you would expect is that when it lands, any plants in the vicinity would, prematurely age and lose their chlorophyll. Um, they would be damaged. Okay, so here you go, another convergence with the Glocke. Um, why is this important? I think it's important because it puts the future humans theory on firmer footing. There's multiple versions of the future humans theory vis-a-vis UFOs, vis-a-vis aliens. Um, and, whether you think the Nordics are our descendants and the Greys are their genetically modified organisms, their little minions, or whether you think the Greys themselves are our descendants, going, 1 million years into the future by, noting the physiological changes that happen between Homo habilis all the way up to Homo sapiens and then projecting those, million years into the future. Whatever your version of the future human hypothesis is, the question one would always have you know, is it possible to create, some kind of space-time metric engineering, right? Can we do this? Will we ever be able to do this, right? It's one thing to write a paper and say it's possible. It's another thing to actually do it. But if the Glocke is real, then we've already done it to in a very limited, very primitive form. Perhaps the Glocke is to the Tic Tac, let's say, what a chariot is to a Tesla car. Okay, both the Tesla car and the chariot work on the same principles. They have wheels, they have axles, um, but propulsion system is very different, right? And then, the Tesla car can do a lot more than the chariot can. Supposedly people who've ridden Teslas and driven Teslas, from what I hear, they say it's basically a computer pretending to be a car. Um, you know, but if the Glock is real, if it actually existed, that would mean that you know the beginnings of our future, the um, already happened, 80 years ago. And that's significant. Um, but if it didn't happen, that's also interesting too, right? Because I think there's two possibilities when it comes to the Glocke. Either it's authentic, it really existed, and it became the foundation for later anti-gravity propulsion, okay, which would mean that we have it now, uh, in some form, um, and that it's hidden away, super secret. So that's a possibility that the Glock is simply real, right? And that you know um, all these people, like the ones that visited Udo Vartanya or the ones who visited George Adamski, they are humans of some kind. The question is, where on the timeline do they come from? Okay, so that's one implication, one possible implication of the Glocke was real. But if the Glocke story is total BS, right? Let's just assume that the Glocke story is total BS. Then what kind of BS is it? Well, it's the you know product of research on the UFO phenomenon, right? If the Glocke story is not real, then whoever concocted it basically looked into um, all these different contactee narratives and actual science that has been done vis-a-vis actual UFOs, and patched them together and tried to, you know, retcon the UFO phenomenon into secret Nazi science, right? So that's significant as well. And then that also puts the future human theory um, on different footing somewhat, because one can't say we've already done it. It still remains a question: can it be done, uh, with regards to anti-gravity? So I mean, or we have done it, but we didn't do it the German way. Who knows? There's a lot of possibilities here, but no matter what you come away with, whether you think the Glocko is real or not, the implications are big regardless, vis-a-vis the UFO phenomenon. And I just want to end with this little passage from Nick, which I thought very relevant with regards to this series that I'm working on the book Prometheus and Atlas. Uh, if you read this quote for yourself, it just goes to show, if the Glock is real, that as Dr. Giorgiani says in his book, as Paul Feyerabend has also said, that scientific theories are not mirrors of reality. They are tools, they are useful fictions that we create to do stuff with. So if the Glocke is real, then whoever invented it, right? Kammler's men, they were not working with general relativity, right? They were using a different model, right? They were telling themselves a different story, a story that enabled them to crack anti-gravity. And that's important because if you read Puthoff's paper, which again is based on general relativity, um, if if you're gonna use general relativity to explain how these things fly, um, the paper says that it would require energy densities that are literally astronomical, right? Um, which suggests to me that general relativity isn't the way to go if we want to actually do this. Um, General relativity might be fine with regards to explaining the effects, but as I've said before, it may not cut the mustard with regards to explaining the cause. And that just kind of, again, is reiterated with this quote by Nick Cook, um, in that, if the Glock is real, then the engineers who made it were using a completely different theory of gravity, something, as he says, probably related to quantum mechanics, something definitely that involves some kind of theory of vortexes, right? Because again, you have that counter rotation principle at work in the engineering. So some kind of physics of the vortex, perhaps some kind of physics of implosion, um, as opposed to explosion, which is how we fly with rockets, right? All fascinating stuff. Let me know what you think in the comments. That's what all the YouTubers say. But I really want to know because, if the Glocka was real and is the basis for current anti-gravity propulsion, okay, science that's being hidden from the world, um, then that really would explain a lot about some UFO cases. And it would put the future humans hypothesis on much firmer footing, right? Because it's a proof of concept that uh, humans can create that kind of technology. Humans can manipulate time after a fashion. The question is to what degree. Um, and that's a very different question to answer than can we do it at all? Um, so yeah, I think the Glock is fascinating. I think it's possible. It is possible that the Glock was real. Okay. For the reasons I just showed. So as always, remember, Your consciousness is not classified, right? If the Glocke was real, it's probably in some wooden crate, in some, forgotten silo in Maryland or Nevada, and you and I will never be able to see it. All we'll be able to do is read about it or read theories about it. But your consciousness isn't classified, right? It's the thing that's most proximate to you. It's closer to you than the nose on your face. So do whatever you can to understand consciousness, your awareness. Learn to meditate. Get a book on remote viewing. Do whatever it takes that is neither illegal or harmful to yourself or others to experiment with your consciousness and learn all about it. And you'll know more about the UFO phenomenon by doing that than by watching this show. So until then, good night. It's late here for me in beautiful Japan. And if you're waking up in the States, good morning. Until next time.